So, well, aloha kako.
Aloha.
So last Ohina, we did Kikwanoa. And well, we did Kikwanoa. Everybody heard about it. This time around, we chose Oihana. And it took us a while to kind of find our footing, and much like Kapolei Ula folks, kind of setting the boundaries of what our Ohina is actually going to look like and be. Because this COVID thing kind of took all of us for a loop, and we had intended to look at kind of the regulation and industrialization of water that really lends to the expansion of population, and because we know we all need water to survive. There's no living being that can survive without it. And so being able to kind of control and have water stores available really lends to economic growth as well as population growth and all sorts of kinds of things that we just take for granted because we're born today and we just have always had water running in our pipes. But that wasn't always the case. And so it's kind of a long run. A lot of it starts in the early 40s with the initial ideas of trying to kind of control and regulate water in a more predictable way instead of relying upon stream flows and surface water. So if we go to the next slide, Auntie. Thank you. This is where we're currently at right now. And the number is deceptively high. It's gonna go down. If you guys have actually read Auntie's reports, unlike me, that kind of, you guys see that I don't do my things all the time, so I'm reticent to read her reports. But the number of our entries have been going down because initially we did a simple Papakilo search for Oihana, and it gave us about 1,500, I think it was at the time, maybe 14. But a recurring advertisement is the majority of that, which is the waterworks asking people to pay their biannual water bill. So we're kind of going through and sifting and pulling out a lot of those redundant ones so that we have entries of substance rather than just a lot of fill. And so that number is slowly going down, but it does span from the earliest mention of the term Oihana, because there's different iterations prior to that. But the earliest is 1857 with that term Oihana, and it continues all the way through the end of the newspapers in 48. Currently, our team has 89 translations, all of varying lengths. Some of them are literally 2 sentences long, some of them are 6 pages long. But total, it's 171.5 pages of the transcription translation. Can we go to the next slide, please, Auntie? So again, one of the earliest references we see with trying to regulate vai for the use of all is in the original Kumukana vai of 1840. Here, specifically, we pulled out that part where it says, "E ha'awi like ka vai, nana aina pau o ia wahi I ho'onele ia mamua I ka vai. O ka ho'oha like I nga mea a pau a kia kua I ho'olaho mai ai no ia wahi. I olu like ai ka mana o ka po'e hana mai ia wahi a ia wahi aku." And so now that it's kind of codified into law, it forces government to come up with strategies and ways to make sure that that happens. And that's really the importance of a constitution, is putting it, or just like a mission statement of a company, is now that there's a goal, what are the strategies, laws, and infrastructure to be put in place to make that happen. And so that's kind of where a lot of the Oihana vai gets its start, is because it's codified now in the Kumukana vai of 1840. Next slide, please. And so a lot of the early regulation is, again, just regulating that surface water and making sure that the streams are flowing cleanly and freely so that people have access to them. This comes out of Kahai, Hawaii in 1861, so it's about 20 years later already. But it says, "E ho'opolole ia ka ho'okahe wai ana no na mea kanu ma na hola I ho'olaha ia I ke la me keia manawa o ka luna o ka Oihana wai." And so this comes out of a whole article that talks about the price of water, because at this point now is when people start to pay for the use of water and the right to access water at certain times. And so now it's not just a free-for-all, you go to the stream when you need it, but depending on what you pay and how much, and the way in which you're using the vai will determine the amount that you pay for. What was I about to say about this?
Residential, business.
Yeah, so there's all different kinds, whether it's just a house, whether there's multiple families in the house using the water, whether you're irrigating fields, whether you're irrigating your yard. And there's different price ranges for it. Gosh, sorry, I just went blind. There was something specific I wanted to say about this quote. Oh, and this is where you start to see that times are regulated. So if we go to the next slide, it's an example of, this came straight out of the water department's records, like their handwritten records, as you guys can see on the right, where it lists from what time of day is someone's time to go and pull water from the stream. So literally from 6 a.m. to 12 noon is Mikogana, whatever. Then it's David Taylor, and it kind of swaps back and forth. And so prior to that, I don't know of any real regulations on vai based on time.
Well, these are the traditional ones. These are the Hawaii.
Yeah.
Fields,
Yeah, so that's what we were saying is a lot of this is just, the initial is just the regulations of surface water. And eventually when they start to create artesian wells and pump water up and have reservoirs and have a more substantial water supply, then they start to regulate it differently. But this kind of time regulation is the initial makings of what would become our modern day Board of Water Supply, and how water is regulated by the gallon now, more so than the amount of time that it's used.
So people would have la vai and manava vai.
This is for
their particular areas, which is kind of cool.
And so that's why we put at the top, excuse me, do you have an appointment? Because you can't just take as you please. Sorry.
Just to say these are lohi rather than, I mean, these are agricultural runs rather than the pipe water, which it gets restricted to, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if you guys heard what Kumu said, but a lot of this initial one, again, because it's surface water, because it's flowing from a stream, it's a lot for agriculture and irrigation, and less so for like drinking and cooking kind of thing. But even when they do implement the piped water, a lot of times they'll regulate times of day on when you can use the water for certain types of activities. Similar to today, where it's less of a regulation and more of a recommendation that you shouldn't be watering your yard in the middle of the day. But back then it was an actual rule that you can't water your yard in the middle of the day. It's like 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon are the allotted times. Can you go to the next one, please? Before I jump into this, kind of going back into our method and procedure in which we attacked all of this. With Kikuanoa, it was very clear and easy, where we just type in Kikuanoa because we're trying to get a snapshot of his life as a whole. So it was easier to just kind of type in Kikuanoa, get the whole spreadsheet, break it up and have that. Because like I was saying earlier, the Oihana vai gets referred to by a bunch of different names over the years. And water itself, the term Ohina vai might not always show up in the article about the regulation and industrialization of water. It makes it sort of difficult. And especially when you have 3 different people trying to do the research, we didn't want things to be overlapping. So we stuck with the term Oihana Vai for now because it gave such a substantial amount of hits that it could keep us busy for a while. But then we also ran into a similar problem to the Ka'au folks, where we split up our Ohina or our spreadsheet into kind of chunks of years. And so it's hard to get a kind of clear, thorough picture because Hina has the first 20 or 30 years, Kainoa has the next chunk, and then I have the last chunk. And so every week we're coming in with like a different picture of where the waterworks is at those different stages. And so to keep all of that in your mind and build out the sections as you go, kind of like how they're building the rail right now, it's kind of hard to keep track of everything. But one of the early ones, and this is one of Hina's, but I'll just speak to it real fast, is when we start to see the price that people are paying for water. And some of these earliest ones are annual fees rather than like how we pay water today, monthly. But just in these first two, the first one is for a house or a store that uses for washing or drinking. And it's a certain price of $10 a year, as opposed to a house that's using it for making food, bathing, washing, and drinking.
Yard.
Well, not this one, but there are yard ones later, and that one is 15. And when you're looking at, I think this was in 1861, I believe, that's quite expensive. So that's why I put that little, I'll have a soda instead because water is so damn expensive. But I'll hand the floor over to Hina for a bit so you guys can stop listening to me.
Mahalo, Pili. Can you go to the next slide, please, Auntie? So like Pili was saying, it was pretty interesting to track the kind of development and regulation of this this resource, or this what do you call it? Like how they call electricity and stuff in the kingdom, because I'd never really looked at stuff like that before, and it wouldn't have been my very first topic to pick, but it's been really a good learning experience. Like Pili said, we covered a really like long swath of time, and it was clear in the beginning from the stuff in the Kanawai that the Ali'i really wanted everyone to have this idea of like equal access. And, you know, they even, some of the language was kind of like, you know, it wasn't so nice before, people didn't have what they needed, and it was really like not very equitable distribution. And we, you know, we want everybody to have water and access to water. And so they start out with that as a goal, and they start to set up the waterworks. And Honolulu town is really the first place to get piped water. And so some of the early articles are kind of interesting. Some of the sort of PR pieces that really tell people and like remind them like, hey, you used to have to hike way, way, way far up into the uplands to get your water. And now this amazing resource just is right in the same room with you. And isn't that phenomenal? And we don't see ladies carrying huge buckets of, you know, laundry up to the river anymore to do their laundry. Now it's like right in the hale. And so it's just interesting to think of how that must have been for the kupuna who actually did have to like go out and get drinking water and bring it back, or, you know, even just to take it out of the stream, like to have it actually piped into your house was a whole nother thing. And so Honolulu is the first place that gets piped water. And it's crazy looking at like the old reports of how they kind of set everything up, which most of that was in Olalohale, but how they build the first reservoir in Nu'uanu that, you know, holds however many millions or thousands of gallons, and how they use that, and the, you know, how they tap the river and how they fill that reservoir, and they have that set aside, and they're drawing from both sources, and they're putting water into Honolulu town. And one of the first things that we see is that the waterworks is the only sort of utility that we know of that's actually generating revenue every year. And so this quote comes out of one of our articles, because they're putting water into people's homes, but they're charging such a good amount for it, I think, that like they're actually generating revenue. Whereas we don't know if other utilities or other services in the government are doing that, and probably not. Later on, we see that a lot of the revenues that the waterworks does generate end up flowing out into other parts of the kingdom and helping to fund the development and running of other things. And so that's kind of interesting. But what comes along with the generation of all that revenue is also quite a bit of public criticism. And so the really fascinating thing is that you can see there's this tension between how much a town can grow and how water limits that. But it only limits it to the extent that your own moral compass kind of also guides you, because the waterworks is turning over, like they're making money or revenues, they're generating revenues every year. And so eventually people start going, well, how come, you know, these things are so bust up, and how come the jail is such a horrific, tiny little stifly place? And, you know, what are you doing with that money? And so the waterworks seems to be spending money on upgrading other infrastructure and putting it into other areas, or at least that's what we're kind of gathering from the limited amount that we have in the papers, because we haven't been able to get into the archives to access much of the actual records from the Oihana Vai. But they're putting it into other stuff, and then they're also at the same time not really reinvesting enough back into the waterworks itself to keep expanding the infrastructure. So what happens is the 1870s comes around, and there's some really, really bad droughts. And around like 72, I think. Try to go to the next slide, please, Auntie. Like late or early 70s, we see some bad droughts, and that one of the issues is that cattle farmers are already not having enough water in Nu'uanu to keep their kalo going. And I thought this small piece was kind of funny. It came from a much longer article, but just the idea that, you know, these guys they're farming kalo, and, you know, it says that they have to, you know, go haul water at night because they don't have enough water, and they'd be pretty pissed off if they went into Honolulu and saw all these people watering the ornamental plants in their yard. So try to go to the next slide, Auntie. And one of their main points in there was that, you know, we should be irrigating our food plants, not our ornamentals. And so in that same time frame, it also talks about how they've already tapped Nu'uanu stream so heavily, Nu'uanu and Paua, that it's a trickle when it meets the ocean, which is quite interesting to me because, you know, it doesn't seem to line up with exactly kind of, you would think it doesn't quite line up with what they thought water would look like. You know, like they probably didn't want to dewater streams completely, but they got this town that's mushrooming and, you know, all this stuff that's happening, and it's a lot to keep up with. And so the other thing that's happening at this time is that there's choke droughts, and they only have this one reservoir in Nu'uanu, and the thing is super low, and there's a really long period of drought. And then what happens is some fires happen, and they see that they don't actually have enough water at times to put out the fires quickly and to be servicing everyone. So people are complaining like, I don't have enough, you know, there's all these restrictions on water use. And then last week we had an article where the Wilson, the mayor, had ordered the shut off of the pipes at overnight because Nu'uanu Reservoir was so low. So the pipes were off, and then at 2:30 in the morning, a fire broke out. And when the Keiki Kinayahi all got there with all their stuff and they set up and they hook up their hoses, and there's no water in the pipes. And so for a full hour, they gotta wait. Oh yeah. They gotta wait for a full hour anyway to get the vai. And so we see fires, and we see these interesting things happening, which kind of get the insurance companies all twisted up, because now people are making claims for their damages, and the insurance company is going, well, you know, the government should be increasing the capacity. How come it's not increasing the capacity? And so there's this huge call to build reservoirs and increase the capacity. And eventually that happens, but it takes a little while. So what I mean is, like, with the moral compass thing, it was kind of like, I'm still wondering about the decision making at the higher levels about when to build the reservoirs and how to spend the money that the waterworks is generating, because it's clear that there's these droughts and these fires and the supply isn't enough. And so as we move into the next era, we see the building of additional reservoirs, and these fires and these problems seem to kind of calm down. But there's definitely a period in history where that's all happening, and you can see that the government is kind of probably trying to like figure out how to manage growth of population with infrastructure and the supply of this resource. So I will hand it over to Heinoa.
Oh no, this is me real fast.
Oh, sorry, Pili.
So now we're getting to the criminals and the crooks, because we just got the fires.
That's your span.
Yeah. And so there's been about, not a ton, but more than you would anticipate, of crooks and criminals coming out of the waterworks. And this one, it was just so ridiculous that this was the one that I chose to share. And this man, Henry Vieira, is going around and collecting rental payments from the Chinese launderers around town at a rate of $15.50 a month, returning $15 back to the department and keeping 50 cents for himself.
Okay.
And eventually he gets caught, and they don't know how long he's been doing it for. So it could have been a lucrative business over the years, but not in the short term run. And it was just retarded. There's another one of a younger office assistant getting caught for gambling because she lost $200 in one night after being accused of stealing, what was it, $2,000, I believe. Yeah. There's just kind of a big run of that. But sorry, now you can go on.
Next slide, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, this is.
Knock, knock.
Okay, Noah.
You're on mute, bro.
Well, I just was talking for the past 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Paul, next slide. Nah. So in the late 1800s, we can see that they're starting to build, they're tapping into Nu'uanu and putting in a system of piping around, especially in Honolulu. And then we start getting some some articles that say, oh, other people need water too. So we have this one that comes out of Kalaupapa, an article from the superintendent of the waterworks giving a report to the Minister of the Interior, saying that they went to Kalaupapa to bring water because the patients in there say, hey, we need water too. So we have one that goes into Waikolu Valley. And they say that they start building this pipe system that took about a month. And in a month, they put down about 11,000 feet of pipe, about 5.5 miles long, straight out of Waikolu, and feeds into Kalawao settlement and Kalaupapa. That was, I think it cost about 20 grand and something like that. So from there, we can start seeing the building of water systems into like how Ohina was saying, into populated areas. And then we was talking about how a series of fires happen, and we're starting to see that there's not enough water. So in the early 1900s, we see an increase of reservoirs being built. And so some of the big ones, in 1906, we seen a article, as you see here, Pa'akalua o Wahiawa, Okia ka luawai nui ma Hawaii nei, and Mahiko will benefit from this endeavor. And inside this article, we can see how huge this thing is. It says it's the most biggest one, but when we start reading the statistics, I think it was 136 feet deep, 460 feet wide, able to hold 2.5 billion gallons of water. And we start seeing this explosion of China to harbor water. And then when you read and you see how big it is, which turns out to be Lake Wilson, for those on Oahu and Wahiawa, this is Lake Wilson. And then reading the title, you can see that, oh, the Mahiko is going to benefit from this. Well, so what about everyone else, you know? And so from those early articles in that Constitution 1840, this should be for everyone. And so we start to see, oh, and then in that same article, down in the end, it says this was funded by a few people, about 5 different people spending $10 million. Well, now we can see that, oh, there's a private investment into this. And so who really owns the water now? Is it really the people now? Or is it starting to be these people that have the money? And they can say, oh, this amount of water will be taken from 8,000 acres, it says, was taken from up in the forest, and about 37 wells dug to supply all this water for Lake Wilson that will pretty much take care of just sugarcane. Yeah, so we can see like in our that title, you know, the crookedness starting to come in, that what once was supposed to be for everyone is starting to be taken by the few. And then we can see that coming in now with a lot of the other big, you know, Alexander and Baldwin, Maryland and Pineapple Company, crookedness in one of, you know, in probably our most valuable vai. We also see other things about different reservoirs and in White and Kaimuki, things leaking here and there, not having enough money to fix them because there's 4 or 5 holes in the reservoir and it's not unable to pump water up 280 feet up, you know. And so we start to see things built and things starting to break down and not having enough money. There's even another article that states that people in the waterworks aren't getting paid because the water Department of Waterworks, no more money, you know. But we start to see, so in the early 1900s, we start seeing a lot of the reservoirs being built. So we go around town, that's kind of when big water is being, you know, kept by the few. Anyway, next slide.
I think this is the last slide.
You're right. Okay, perfect.
But like we said, water kind of permeates just life. And it goes over this huge expanse. And so going back to Kaho'okahi, he brought it up earlier with the William Auld being the Mahele Olalo for Kalani. That was super illuminating for us, because about 2 weeks prior to that article coming up, because I'm lucky I get to sit by Kumu's side and see everybody's articles and kind of what everyone is doing. So I sort of have an idea, although I don't remember everything like Kumu does. But I think 2 weeks prior to that article coming up in your guys' group, we had one where the Ahahui come over to the Oihana vai, the Ke'anauka Oihana vai. And I can't remember exactly what they're asking, but Kalani is the one who asks the question in Hawaiian, and then Kaulia is the one who translates it in English. And so we see multiple examples of that. And so it kind of, I don't know if he was being Ke'elikolani-esque and refusing to speak English, or if he actually couldn't speak English. And so it's just a kind of interesting kind of side anecdote and connection there. But also the waterworks tends to function and operate for the government in much the same way that Lucy Peabody operates for her Ohana. She is the money bags of her Ohana, and everybody is constantly writing to her for money. She's the support system for everyone else. And the Oihana vai almost cannot support itself because it's too burdened supporting everybody else and all the other government agencies, like Hina was talking about, in that a lot of its revenue that it is generating, rather than being reinvested to renovate and expand and improve, it's getting sucked away so that other government agencies can just survive. And so there's multiple editorials that get written in because they want to stop and keep the water money in the water department. But then everybody's like, well, what about all of these other departments that rely upon that money? And so it becomes this big tug of war. And I'm kind of excited because it creeps into the territorial period, which if we think that we don't know much about the kingdom era, I feel like most of us know even less about the territorial time. And a lot of us spend less time there in our history. It's like a big gap from kingdom to modern statehood kind of history. And so we're slowly reaching that point, and it sucks because we have about 4 more weeks, so we won't get heavily into it. But just right now, we're seeing the division of counties in the territorial period and how the water is now, because in the kingdom, it's under the executive power through the Minister of the Interior and the Office of Public Works. But in the territorial government, it switches over to be a county resource and utility. And so there's big struggles because it's such a big moneymaker, who actually gets control of water. Because if you're pulling it out of the territorial government and putting it in the counties, now the territory is losing out on a lot of money on their side. And so there's some issues and hooky, and that's currently the state and status of where we're at.
And the last piece that I do hope we get to, just to add at least a little bit of it in, is like the generation of electricity, hydroelectric stuff with water. We're hoping there's a few pieces I think about that, and like when the palace gets power, or when the city gets the lights in the city get turned on and that kind of stuff. So we're hoping that we have time to throw some of that into, because that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And looking at Nu'uanu and Honolulu, kind of, they really are the first place. They're the place of a lot of firsts, and so we see things being tried out there and developed there first, and then being those same technologies and methods being used in other places. And so, yeah, just hope we get to the Huilavai also.
Yeah.
I want to toss in just a couple of things that, one, Hina, you mentioned the notion of, you don't have to go up and get water. You don't have to haul the laundry over to the river. You can, we all know the social movement from the country to the city. It seems almost like natural, but that was part of the attraction, was that life was so luxurious. You rent a room and you had water. Lots of things were in place. But the other thing was that, well, there were other things too. I'll get back to that. Well,
Seriously.
I am. I'll call you back. Sorry. But I wanted to mention the notion of, there were lots of water systems in place, mostly with surface waters where people control them. And as we're seeing through the process of this, is the government having to purchase those as they move out. So first Pauoa, they're buying the rights in Pauoa, so that's, and then artesian wells are actually a new technology 40, 30 years later, so that people start to build artesian wells, then the city is acquiring them. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's a critique that the king sells the well on Pu'alelani, and he sells it for more than it costs to dig it, and he kept part of the water for himself. Well, there's that. But I also wanted to comment on this notion of private investors then doing, like, what was it with Lake Wilson, that wasn't at all seen as crooked, but it's definitely the rise of capitalism, is that whole notion, and it's a changing social notion of what is public good as opposed to, well, I can afford to do it, so does that give me more rights? And that's, there's this opens doors in lots of directions, is what I would say.
Yeah. And that article that you're mentioning about that particular reservoir, they say this will allow the sugar production to increase by twice the amount.
Right.
It opens up that
amount of land. So it's a whole series of interesting, multiple processes going on, but the Oihana Vai is sort of the link to all of that. that notion of the first listing of, you get Monday from 9 to 12, those are surface waters. That's actually the codification of what was the ancient system. That's what a konohiki did. You get 12 people with kopapaloi, hono hono hoia ka manava ka la and malamai oi me oi kapai, and they all had kuleana to keep the awais clean, keep them open, but it was allotted by the konohiki. That's why you had good konohiki, bad konohiki, favoritism, any kind. But that's where it gets codified. Once you get down to Monday 9 to 12, well, that's pretty clear, So it's an interesting system going to play. Anyway, I have nothing but delight. I get to play with all of these, so I have had tastes of them all. Many other questions on water stuff?
I have a question.
You?
Auntie, can you go, well, you guys can just answer the slide that had articles that named $10 and $15 annual fees. What year was that?
I think it was like 61.
Yeah, or maybe even a tiny bit earlier. There's a couple fee schedules that we translated.
It keeps changing, yeah.
It seems super expensive.
It is.
Yeah, I mean, we did some, I think I found like an inflation calculator or whatever and looked at it and I was like, I mean, I think it's a little bit more than what we pay now. Yeah.
But we're in a very different money economy too.
Yeah.
But a very different rate for a bar or a business that had a single sink perhaps paid 10, but a household that would have had sinks, wash tubs, and a yard to water, there you go, 15, blah, blah, blah. It made sense on assumed usage, right? So.
Well, and then the other thing too about like how much it costs, it did seem a little bit expensive to us when we were first looking at it. But then we thought, if that gives you access to water all the time, then that's okay. But what you hear from a lot of people, you get a lot of complaints, people writing in going, what's up with all of these limits and closures? And, it sounds like that very often they go, everybody shut off the pipes. And then if there's a fire, it's like nobody can use any water, because all the water needs to be channeled to the fire or whatever. And so you get a lot of like customer complaints because there's really just not quite enough, until much later in the game.
Yeah, because a lot of that early water just relies heavily on like gravity and pressure to be piped, kind of like old broadband internet. So if somebody's on the phone and you're on the internet, it's not going to work. So a lot of these people have to turn off so all the water pressure can actually make it to the hydrant to put out these fires.
Are you old enough to remember dial-up?
Of course I am.
I'll be darned. Okay.
Well, also that slide had twice, I thought the first time it was interesting, and then I saw it again. Vai'einu for drinking water instead of just waiinu.
There was some funky language in some of the governmental stuff. I'm like, who is writing this stuff?
It wasn't vai'eholoi, it was vaiholoi, vai'au'au, vai'hanaika, and then you get to drinking water as vai'einu. So.
Yeah,
they took it out of the woolly, that's why.